It's Jay Strongo, Chahajifka, Elisa Douglas Stowis. Hi, my name is Elisa Douglas. I am Student Program Coordinator here at Northeastern State University Center for Tribal Studies, and welcome you to our 48th Annual Symposium on the American Indian. This session is titled Reorganizing Tribal Sovereignty, the IRA and Boilerplate Constitutionalism with Jair Peltier, Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, from the University of Southern California. As you probably know, this session is one of many that are included in this year's virtual agenda. Please do take time to visit our website at nsuok.edu/symposium for more details regarding the agenda. All sessions will be recorded and made available in the coming weeks. Jair Peltier is a second-year PhD student at University of Southern California's Department of Political Science and International Relations. He graduated from University of Minnesota Morris with a BA in Political Science, minoring in History and Anthropology. His research is interested in tribal sovereignty in North America and tribal constitutions in the United States. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Peltier, and I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. Let's just dive right into it. I will share my screen and let's see here. Have my presentation ready for you. Okay. And present. Okay. Should be working. Okay. Well, technical difficulties. All right. So my presentation today is just going to be discussing the history of the Indian Reorganization Act and its impact on tribal constitutions. There has been research done on this in regards to the Indian Reorganization Act and its effect on tribal constitutions. Specifically, people like to measure people have measured oaths to office, as well as blood quantum measurements and things like that. And so I just want to kind of look at some commonalities between tribes that adopted IRA constitutions and how that continues to have an impact. So we're going to start by looking at the Dawes Act, and then the Meriam Report, Indian Reorganization Act, Boilerplate Constitutions, and its influence today. Now, if it wants to work for me, there we go. Okay, the Dawes Act of 1887. Now, the Dawes Act was designed to break up tribes and encourage individuality. These were very contrasting to the indigenous perspectives that saw, land and things being communally owned and everyone being a part of a general collective. It also encouraged the building up of agriculture, which most indigenous societies, especially in the plains and things like that, did not utilize agriculture. And it was mainly used as a way of reducing administrative costs. The US government had noticed that it became very, very expensive to manage the tribes and the Indian affairs. And so they really wanted a way of making some money on the side, making them more productive. And so they divided the territories between families. They allotted land to individuals in the hopes that they would adopt Western forms of productivity. It also would secure reservation territory, kind of bringing Indian territory into solid units and then opening up the remainder of the land to white settlers. This was all in the mission of Manifest Destiny and kind of really trying to enable the American Indian to become assimilated. This is essential. The Dawes Act is essentially the federal government's primer for assimilation to indigenous people. Okay. And so the Dawes Act was in effect for several decades, allotments and things like that. But what the federal government started to notice is that the tribes were becoming very poor, impoverished. And so the federal government initiated what is known today as the Meriam Report. It was a report it was a study that was conducted by the Institute for Government Research, which is today known as the Brookings Institute. And it was partially funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, things like that. And Louis Meriam was assigned to kind of lead the way in the study. And what the study ended up finding was several points to inform policy making, policy decisions. And some of the main highlights of the report include health, education, and general economic conditions. And so Louis Meriam tied much of the poor health conditions to a lack of food supply. Many of the reservations were beholden to the BIA agents and things like that. And there was a lot of times that rations and things that would feed people were being held up or sold off by bureau agents who were trying to make a little money on the side. And so there were a lot of American Indian people who were starving at this time, specifically due to lack of agricultural development, because they didn't really understand or they didn't want to do these agricultural practices. And the federal government was withholding their allotted rations. And then education, the Meriam Report ended up critiquing education as the boarding schools were poorly structured. They relied on student labor, things like that. It was essentially seen as a very poor experiment for assimilating the children because they were so fractionalized. One boarding school may do one thing, and then other boarding schools may do other things. So the Meriam Report heavily critiqued that mode of operations that the federal government had been doing, but it fell short of critiquing assimilation generally. It was while they critiqued the boarding school conditions and called for better schools, they still called for assimilationist policies. They still called for students to become assimilated into the what they called the major culture, which was the American culture. And then finally, the Meriam Report also made recommendations based on the general economic conditions of the reservations and the tribal nations. And they tied the poor economic conditions to the Dawes Act specifically. They said that the Dawes Act, in allotting land, ended up creating an environment where the people were all separated. They had no way of kind of banding together. And they also had poor land quality. The land quality that most natives were allotted was not suitable for agriculture. So the federal government wanted the Indians to develop agriculture, but they did not want to give the good land to the American Indians. It was kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They wanted to show that the American Indians were incapable of governing themselves. They wanted to show that the American Indians were a lesser civilization. Of course, we know that that's not correct. And so the Meriam Report directly informed the decisions of policymakers to create the IRA, which is what this presentation is mostly about. Okay. So the Indian Reorganization Act, also known as the IRA, was developed initially by an American Indian sympathizer named John Collier. And John Collier, he was an advocate for indigenous people. Actually, you can see him here in this picture. That's John Collier right there in the middle. He's very sympathetic to the plight of indigenous people, and he actually even encouraged the U.S. government to adopt indigenous perspectives and things like that to strengthen American institutions. And of course, we all know that the United States was heavily influenced by indigenous governance even before the American Revolution. The Iroquois League of the North American continent heavily influenced the founders of this country in their ideas of separation of powers and things like that. But John Collier was at the time very controversial. People didn't want to agree with John Collier because remember they still wanted to imagine that the American Indian was somehow a lesser civilization, a lesser culture. It was inferior to American progress, liberalism, classical liberalism, and so he wasn't very popular at the time. But he still made his recommendations. He helped develop the Indian Reorganization Act. And actually, the original concept of the Indian Reorganization Act was very supportive of indigenous autonomy, of indigenous sovereignty. And actually, the IRA ended the allotment. The Meriam Report had recommended not to do away totally with the allotments, but to extremely conserve them. But over time, of course, between the Meriam Report and the IRA, the allotment was kind of abandoned by the federal government as its main policy. And while it included provisions of self-governance and things like that, Congress retained its power of oversight, its trust relationship with the Indian tribes. And it also retained the power of the BIA with oversight. And it included provisions that said that tribes would have to vote, right? If tribes voted in favor of the IRA, they could start to adopt their own constitutions. But these constitutions were not created by the tribes directly. They were kind of provided for them by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. BIA had boilerplate constitutions, or at the very least, had outlines that were drafted by BIA lawyers, and that they said basically as soon as a tribe would vote in favor of its own governance provisions, the BIA would send them boilerplate constitutions, and they would adopt those. And in my research specifically, I'm kind of looking for the commonalities between these boilerplate constitutions and how they impact tribal sovereignty directly. And so what I've determined is kind of four main kind of overarching themes that I find in these boilerplate constitutions. The first being territory and membership, then the governing bodies, and deference to the federal government, or at the very least, federal recognition. So first of all, territory. Many of these constitutions enable tribes, well, actually not enable, they bind tribes to their reservations. So within these constitutions from the 30s, you see a lot of references to the boundaries of the reservation. So remember, indigenous people are not territorial. We were never really territorial. Indigenous people were tied to their community, not to the land directly beneath them. They didn't identify as an arbitrary border, right? They recognize themselves within their language, within their social context, within their society, often matriarchal. But what these constitutions did is they tied the nations to these reservation boundaries. That also included allotted lands outside the reservation. Oh, let's see here. Oh, okay. I can turn off my camera and we'll see if that helps. I see now that I have, I'm kind of cutting in, my sound is kind of cutting in out. So yeah, I'll give that a try here. Let's see. Okay, we'll see if this helps. And let me know if it does. But where was I? Oh yes, and it also codified land ownership. So while land ownership of American Indians was codified in the American governmental system. It wasn't necessarily codified within the indigenous governance systems. But these constitutions provided that. They provided this kind of understanding that there would be land ownership within these reservation boundaries and allotted lands, and that these land ownership rights would be protected. And also within the territorial clauses is always a deference to U.S. law. So what this means is that the tribes, while they can make regulations on their territories and everything like that, it must be within lockstep of the U.S. law. So not only does the U.S. declare that Congress is maintains a trust relationship with the American Indian tribes, now it is in the tribal constitutions that there is this trust relationship, that there is a deference to U.S. law. And so that right there inhibits and limits tribal sovereignty. That is the first step. It inhibits American Indian conceptions of territory and binds it to a Western conception. Come on now. Oh, there we go. Okay, and now membership clauses. The membership clauses essentially codify blood quantum. Now, blood quantum is a system that measures your indigeneity by how much Indian blood you have. It is as old as Spanish colonization. The picture in the back here is the Spanish casta, the caste system of the Spanish Empire. That basically, the more Indian blood you had, the lower on social pyramid you were, and also the more African blood you had, the lower you were on the pyramid. The people on top, of course, were full-blood Spanish people who were born in Spain. Over time, this evolved into the English system and then eventually the American system. And the effects of blood quantum was to reduce the amount of Indians on the land. There were two systems that were involved in colonial America. One drop for African people and blood quantum for Native people. One drop indicated that you had one drop of African ancestry, one drop of African blood, you are a slave. Blood quantum is, the more white you are, the less Native you are. The more white blood you have, your indigeneity goes away. And what it did was it increased the amount of people who could be slaves. So it increased the labor force for the slave owners, and it reduced the amount of Native people who had legitimate claim to the land. And like the territorial clauses before, blood quantum was not codified into indigenous constitutions or indigenous perspectives. It was codified in the American colonial systems. But with the IRA, now blood quantum is placed right in the center of membership. And remember, indigenous people didn't necessarily see membership as being a blood relationship or even being a related relationship. Indian people had a very interesting system of adoption, and anyone could become a member. Even prisoners of war eventually would become members of the society that they were a part of. As long as you knew the language, as long as you knew the customs, you were a member of that tribe. You were a citizen in modern language. But what blood quantum what the IRA did is it tied blood quantum to indigenous membership within their own constitutions. So, and again, it's limiting their ability as sovereign tribes to measure their own citizenship. Other countries in the world, they use various measures of measuring membership in their respective nations. But blood quantum effectively, it ensures that with every passing generation, there will be less and less legitimate claims to membership, which is really the overall goal, again, of assimilation. Another way that this inhibits tribal sovereignty is that it ties it all to census rolls as well. It ties the claims of membership to census rolls at the time of adoption, right? So some tribes in the 1930s, they base their membership on the rolls of the 1930s. Some tribes measure them on the rolls of 1940s. But it is all with this orientation towards American measurements of indigenous people. And a lot of times what you'll find is in tribal constitutions, at the very least, it's a quarter of Indian blood is necessary to have membership. Again, with every passing generation, it reduces the amount of legitimate claims. And again, there's this deference to the federal government, because within the membership clauses, there is often a deference to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State has to sign off on these. Secretary of State, certifies the census rolls, etc. And now with governing bodies, what we see is within these constitutions, the governing bodies are often limited to this, either a business council or a council, or a governmental council, not necessarily tied to business or commerce or anything like that. But we see what the motive behind this is becoming is really this idea that the Native people need to start developing their economies. They need to start developing their business, their business minds, in order to become useful to the American system. But of course, much of this is predicated on Western, classical liberalist ideas that were not present in indigenous societies. Private property, individualism, etc. And what this does is it creates a system where we have a chairman and council representatives. And the issue with this is it doesn't necessarily give much mind to the reasoning behind these systems. They're trying to ensure that tribes adopt more Western style institutions, governmental institutions, without giving much thought to the mechanisms behind those institutions. So the balance of power, the separation of powers, is supposed to be rooted in a Western concept of the rule of the one, the few, and the many, the Roman triumvirate, right? Where you have one emperor, you have a few senators, and then you have the masses, all represented within the government. The United States imitates this by having a president representing the one, having a Congress representing the many, and a Supreme Court representing the few. This is the kind of an aristocratic kind of institution. But with the tribes, this doesn't play out as well, because most tribes didn't adopt a judiciary until decades later. Within the IRA, they're trying to force separation of power without considering why it works in the first place. And the system that was kind of enforced on Indian people didn't work. It doesn't work because the authentic separation of powers, while seemingly there, is not there. And again, there's deference to the reservation superintendent, which is a BIA official, Bureau of Indian Affairs official. And the deference to the reservation superintendent include deference within their election processes. In order for the election processes to move forward, the reservation superintendent, a representative of the federal government at the time, often a white person, had to approve it, had to interfere. And it also did away with kind of the traditional governing bodies, which may have been hereditary, which may have been more loose in terms of who holds what titles. Some indigenous societies didn't necessarily have an executive kind of authority figure or a legislative authority figure. A lot of times it was just elders coming together and discussing the matters of the tribe with general consent of the people, not necessarily having votes or voting, having a democracy, but having general consensus. Consensus is key to understanding indigenous perspectives on governance, and consensus is not present in this in the IRA, in the Indian Reorganization Act. And influence today. So over the years, tribes have moved kind of away from the IRA, while these constitutions are still in place, the era of self-determination has really influenced these IRA constitutions. A lot of tribes have had constitutional amendments, have had constitutional reform. The Navajo Nation, for instance, no longer has a written constitution. I don't know if they ever did. They ever adopted one, but today they do not have a written constitution. They determined that it was not a part of their traditional perspectives, and so they did away with the notion of it. Much like Great Britain doesn't have a written constitution either, if you want a Western example of that playing out. So the tribes have reimagined their constitutions. They have gone away from the IRA, but the IRA is still present within them. So while tribes have kind of adapted their constitutions to reflect more autonomy, for instance, many tribes changed their names from simply, like for instance, in North Dakota, the three affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. Today they're called the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, but under the IRA they were called the three affiliated tribes of the Fort Berthold Reservation. Again, kind of limiting their kind of notion of self-reliance, self-autonomy, of being a sovereign nation. So many tribes have chosen to change their names to reflect that idea of having a sovereign nation, of being a sovereign nation. But they still contain within them, oftentimes, these three instances that I mentioned prior, of territory being bound to reservation boundaries, membership being tied to blood quantum, and the governing bodies being tied to this tribal chairman and council. So while there are moves going forward to increase indigenous autonomy, and in fact, some tribes have reoriented their membership, even changing the descendancy requirements from the 1940s or 50s to the 1980s. But again, it's tied to this certified census count. Again, deferring to the federal government. So while the tribes are moving more towards autonomy of self-determination, there is still very present this deference to the federal government. And of course, the times are changing. With the head of the Interior Department is an Indigenous woman. So perhaps that deference to the federal government will become less and less problematic, but it nonetheless still infringes on this idea that tribes are sovereign, fully sovereign nations, or that they ought to be. So overall, I would say that moving forward, my kind of prescription on the whole thing would be that tribes need to reevaluate their concepts of territory as being tied to sovereignty. They need to reevaluate blood quantum as a measure of membership and citizenship, even changing the language surrounding it. If we are truly a sovereign nation, are we members of a club, or are we citizens of a nation? Changing that language can be very powerful as well. And changing government bodies. If we are going to adopt more Western styles, we have to understand the underlying mechanisms that make them work in the Western context, or we should consider ways of kind of introducing traditional perspectives more so into the makeup of our tribal governing bodies, such as more of a leading role for elders and spiritual figures, such as medicine people and things like that. Actually, there is one more thing I wanted to note. As for the constitutional amendments, many constitutional amendments are done by popular referendum, which is not very common even in the Western system. And so even the mechanisms by which the constitutions can be changed is very heavily influenced by the United States, making it far more complicated and difficult to make meaningful constitutional change. The US government doesn't even do popular referendum for constitutional change. and yet they expected tribes to adopt this as a means of constitutional reform, making it a much slower process, making it a much more difficult process to make meaningful change within the tribal context. And that is all I have for today. So Tim McGwitch, thank you very much. And does anybody have any questions?
For those who are joining us this afternoon, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and present your questions. We do have a link for a audience survey in our chat. So if you have a moment, please complete that for us as well. We appreciate your feedback.
And I would like to note too that one of the things about my research that I find to be very valuable is kind of reimagining epistemological approaches to knowledge and knowledge sharing. And so I really do welcome people to ask questions, because I believe that knowledge sharing isn't so one direction, right? Like in Western institutions, it's oftentimes like this, structured like a lecture with people listening and everything. So I do welcome that kind of collaboration. Please speak up. It's more indigenous, I would say, to have a two-way kind of conversation about these things.
We do have one question in the chat, and that is, I just saw it just a minute ago. Do you think tribes will ever get away from the white man's roles for membership?
Oh, I hope so. So I do. So I do not necessarily see that happening in the immediate future. I do believe that with the up and coming generation, my generation, we do see more of an understanding of tribal sovereignty on levels that we didn't necessarily do before. I can stop sharing quick too. I do think that we will move away from it eventually, as long as we continue to understand the issues, not necessarily just taking them at face value, but actually analyzing and evaluating the causes of these problems. So while I don't necessarily see that going away in the immediate future, I do have hope. I cling to hope with all my my research on indigenous sovereignty and things like that. I do hope for it. I know one of the tribes in one of the Ojibwa tribes in Minnesota recently kind of wanted to move away from that, and it's still in the works, but it remains to be seen. But I do think it will happen. I just might be, gone beforehand, but that's okay, because the work that we do today is not supposed to benefit us. It's supposed to benefit the generations in the future. So I'm hopeful that the work that we all do and that I do here today will enable people to move away from it in the future. I always say that the future is indigenous because the past is indigenous, right? Thank you for your question. Any other questions? Okay. What aspects of the impacts of the IRA are going to be the hardest to untangle? Well, I would say the hardest aspects of the IRA that will be to untangle would be the ones that have been internalized. So indigenous people have to in a way, indigenous people have been in a false consciousness due to the effects of the IRA, where we think about our connection to our tribe as being tied to our blood. We think about our blood quantum as really being an accurate measure or a good description for membership. the governments can change, the governments can change those measures, but if people continue to internalize that conception, it's not going to go anywhere. The same thing with territory, with land ownership. As long as Indian people continue to internalize the concept of land ownership and territorial ownership, we won't be able to move away from it and to move towards more communal understandings of land ownership, things like that. So I would say that that's what needs to happen first and foremost, is just kind of reimagining our sovereignty on the personal level, on the individual level. It's kind of ironic in a way. It has to be internalized by the individual to benefit the collective. But yeah, that's what I would say moving forward would need to happen. Thank you for your question. And now I have someone asking, can you say more about British having no constitution? So yes, I can. So Great Britain, contrary to popular belief, does not have a written constitution. They have a constitution that is comprised of traditions and kind of conventions. So there is no official document that says this is how the British government is set up. It's just that you have everyone believing that there is a queen and she has absolute power, but she relinquishes her power to a parliament that creates laws on her behalf. That isn't written down anywhere in any constitution, but it is a part of their constitutional law. It's all imagined. It's all based on, like I said, traditions and conventions. And so in a lot of ways, I think it's very similar to indigenous constitutions of the past. So we know that tribes had treaties before the federal government or before even colonial contact. Tribes made treaties with each other, even though they didn't necessarily have written language. And so the fact that we know that they had treaties, unwritten, spoken treaties and agreements, I would say that it's not unreasonable to imagine that they had unwritten constitutions, in that they had traditions and conventions that they adhered to. Even though it wasn't written down, it was generally understood, just like in Great Britain. And so I think that's kind of an interesting way to place to point to, is to show that if the British have done this, and written constitutions aren't necessarily so much of a foundational hallmark of Western conceptions of sovereignty, then we can start to break down the Western conceptions of sovereignty that have been imposed on us by the American government and kind of reconstruct our own, which is within an oral context, an unwritten context. Thank you for your question. Does anyone else have any other questions?
You have another one. Can you point to a tribal government structure that is least influenced by the U.S. and or the IRA?
I would say it's difficult because there are so many that are, even though they have had constitutional reform, like the general ideas, like the idea of governing by business council, the idea of governing by a council is very much influenced by the IRA. I would say that the Navajo Nation is the least influenced by the U.S. and the IRA, because, like I said, they moved to having an unwritten constitution. So right there, that is a huge step away from these Western conceptions that are present in the IRA. And they also have, they don't call their executive officer, they don't call him chairman. They call him president. There's the president of the Navajo Nation, and just the fact that they call themselves nation instead of tribe of this reservation or tribe or band or whatever. They call themselves nation. They are trying to tie their legitimacy as a sovereign nation. They're trying to place it on the same level as international powers. So I study international relations as well as American politics. And in international relations, the biggest players in international decision-making are the nation states. And while they don't necessarily see themselves as a state, the fact that they really place emphasis on that nation aspect is very telling. And they have also moved beyond at least have tried to move beyond this limitation by the federal government that says basically the tribes can't, approach foreign governments and things like that. The federal government hasn't necessarily ever said that, but it is heavily implied, like don't talk to other foreign nations, don't talk to other people. But the Navajo Nation has made trade agreements with the nation of Cuba in the past, because the Navajo Nation is the biggest I think it is the biggest agricultural tribe in the country. They have the biggest agricultural system and programs. So they made agricultural trade agreements with the nation of Cuba, and I think that is the big step in emerging from this this kind of exclusive relationship with the federal government, is to start seeking relationships with nations that are not the U.S. government, that is not the U.S. Congress and the president. So I would say that the Navajo Nation for sure is definitely the least influenced by the IRA today. But I would hope that in the coming years, in the coming decades, we'll start to see that influence diminish and fade away as tribes start to gain more legitimacy beyond the current system. Thank you for your question.
I have a question that you touched on just a little bit there, and maybe you can expand on it a little bit. I'm just curious if more tribal governments were to do away with or not use the template from the U.S. Constitution, but exercise their sovereignty more and more of their own how they see leadership within their own tribe. And if they were to change that, how might that change the our government to government relationship? Especially with the of course the U.S. federal system and all that. But go ahead.
Well, it would be quite a dramatic change, that's for sure, a drastic change. That's kind of the trouble of it, is we do not want to necessarily invoke the anger of the federal government. The federal government, for all we know, doesn't want the system to ever go away. For all we know that, all most Congress members might not ever want this system to stop, because it is beneficial for them to continue this relationship where tribes are very inhibited by the federal system. So if tribes start to move away from that system, I have a feeling that the federal government will be very resistant. Of course, with the as we've seen in the last election, Native voices are really being lifted up more so than they have in the past. The Obama administration had established kind of a council of all the tribes to come to the White House every year and have a yearly kind of summit with the indigenous leaders. That was a good step. But once again, it doesn't put indigenous tribes into an international context. Again, it's trying to limit it to conversations with only the federal government. And I think a lot of it has to do with the federal government knowing that there are so many treaties that they have where they have to guarantee, certain things like education, healthcare, in exchange for large swaths of land. And if the tribes start to kind of move away from the current system, there could be legal justification for taking the land back, I would say. We already saw that in a very recent Supreme Court case where they determined that half of Oklahoma is Indian territory. And it never stopped being Indian territory. It's just that everybody believed that it wasn't. That could start happening all across the country. And I think if tribes start to really reestablish themselves as international power figures and use the Supreme Court against the United States in a way, we could start to see a return of a lot of land to tribal nations. So that's kind of how I would see it playing out, is the government would be very reluctant, but if we can create the proper arguments legally, either the US will have to break its own laws, which it has in the past, so it wouldn't be that surprising, or there would be international outcry, demanding that we retain our legitimacy and get our land back. But maybe that's too maybe that's too optimistic, but that is how I see it playing out.
Great, thank you. So I just wanted to, again, to quickly point out the link in the survey. But please complete that for us before you leave this session today. If there aren't any other questions, might give a second or two if anybody else had any questions. But if not, then we thank you, Mr. Peltier, for joining us today and sharing your information with us. We greatly appreciate it. And hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate all of you being here. Thank you very much. And if there are no other questions, I suppose, then that's where we'll leave it. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day. Do you guys, is my email address available to everybody? I don't know if it was on your roster or something. I could just put it in the chat right here too. So if anybody ever has any questions, you can just email me and I'll be sure to get back to you. It's just jpeltier@usc.edu. So if you ever want to talk about these kinds of topics or things like that, you're more than welcome to reach out to me and I can help you out the best I can. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day. See y'all later.